I understand why people say printing, because what it connotes with the printing is that basically that like it's coming out of nowhere, it's pulling money out of thin air. But what we know is that in terms of printing, right, the Federal Reserve, doing QE, the Fed's actually drawn down its balance sheet for several years. And the folks on FinTwit just will not acknowledge that they've been doing QT, that their actual balance sheet as holdings, both nominally and as a percentage of GDP, have declined, right? So what has the government done? The government has borrowed a lot more money. They're continuing to borrow a lot more.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're running at clips that are effectively wartime from historical purposes, 6 to 7% GDP. They're borrowing a lot of money. But what I want to emphasize that is that in my mind, and people take a lot of issue with this, I don't view that as printing. And here's why. Because to get that money, someone needs to give the government the money, right? Someone from the private sector or from another country, something outside the government, they have to say, here you go, Janet Yellen, it's yours. Here's your $4 trillion you need to roll U.S. debt. That is pulling $4 trillion. And some of the folks I talked to on Bitcoin Twitter are just ignoring that. They're ignoring that somebody had $4 trillion. Somebody gave that $4 trillion to the government. Now, I'm all with you on the monetization, taking money from government securities and throwing it on the Fed's balance sheet. But you got to realize that's not happening right now. That hasn't happened for years. The Fed has drawn down its balance sheet. The Fed has been hiking rates and trying to desperately pump the brakes on an overheated, from an inflationary standpoint, economy. But if you're going to say, to your point, your bigger point, which is, is the government going to keep spending? Yes, absolutely. I will guarantee you the government will keep spending at a very high clip. But then the question becomes, if we're going to have an informed discussion, Brandon, is what is the proper rate of government spending? Because the government also pulls in revenue, right? The government also withdraws revenue in the form of taxation. So one of the things that economists look at is, and if you ever, just to explain this for people that don't have an economics background as I do, from the university, it's like the economics argument always, when it comes to spending, it always has to reconcile what is the productive capacity of the country versus what is its spending, right? And the reason you want to start there, and that's gross domestic product, right? You usually want to say it's because you need some metric. It'd be like the analogy, and I'm hesitant to always use personal finance, but let's talk about your house, right? If I only showed you on a paper the expenditures you're making, and I only showed you the debts you take on, credit card debt, household debt, that doesn't really tell you anything. It's kind of irrelevant. Like these guys that show up, and I've seen this from many people in both FinTwit and Bitcoin space. They'll show you this chart that's vertical of U.S. debt, right? I'm sure you've seen that. It goes straight up. It's a parabolic chart, right? Well, they don't show you the chart that's shown our growth in productivity, which is also it's not parabolic, but it's gone up pretty high, right? That's productive capacity. So what they say, the proper measure, right, you're trying to offset this is you're trying to figure out, what is GDP relative to your debt, or what is GDP relative to your debts and deficits? Like I said, it's 6 to 7%, right? Those give you a better reference. And the reason you want to do that, that's like in the household analogy, that's like the reference between income and your liabilities, right? Your income, assets, liabilities. Now, I'll give you another way to think about the debt issue. Think about it instead of just income, productive capacity to expenditures. Think about it in the context of overall net worth. Okay, what is the net worth of the United States? It's almost very difficult to measure, right? There isn't a single country in the world right now that if you could swap places with the United States, they wouldn't pick it, because of our natural resource base, our manufacturing base, our IP, all of our court system, our legal system, friendly neighbors to the north and south. There's aircraft carriers, every single thing. Like every country in the world would be like, if I could switch places with the United States, I probably would, even with all of our problems, even with all of our hardships. So the reason why that's significant is that when you're measuring our liabilities, our debts, okay, our deficits, you have to factor in and we also have the global reserve currency. And we have the bond market behind us, and we have the military, and we have all these other factors. And by the way, our growth relative to the world, our percentage of global GDP in terms of productive capacity, that has actually increased in the last several years. In other words, of what the world is creating, because productive capacity is really wealth. I mean, that's the ability to produce things, that's really wealth. It's not paper money, of course. The ability to produce things and expand that wealth as a percentage of global wealth, of global productivity, that is actually increased. What that means is we are outpacing our peers in terms of growth, which, many of our peers have much worse problems than us. And that is significant when you're trying to say, like, okay, do I put capital here? Do I put capital here? Do I trust the U.S. Treasury market, or do I trust, the Chinese bond market, or or German Bunds or some other competitor? Where are you going to put that money? That's the question. In the other context, and the other important thing about debt is that, let me ask you a question. Are you against debt in general? Like, do you think all debt is bad? I don't.
No, absolutely not.
I think there's productive debt. Like, right. Mm-hmm. So I'll give you examples of things I think that were productive enterprises that we engaged in. Right. So, to me, the federal funding that went to an interstate highway system was extraordinarily productive debt, right?
Yeah.
pretty useful. The debt that went into building the Hoover Dam, which provided tons of electricity, right? Like, that was productive debt. There are plenty of ways to spend money that are productive. There are also ways that I think are wasteful. And that's the key, right? Like entitlement programs that are bloated and underfunded. I think that a lot of those folks would be better off if they would have, instead of having that money taken from them in a paycheck, had that extra cash every paycheck to invest and have opportunities, right? I think those programs, which are underfunded, and I think they will not provide a quality of life, they were really put in place more of a safety net for a certain segment of the population, like Social Security, for example. It's a perfect example. Put in place originally to lift seniors out of poverty in an era where there were much fewer people living to be 65 and older and drawing in the system, right? So it was never meant to be sort of a UBI for folks when they get older, right? Just because people didn't live that long. That we live in a totally different system, right? So from the 1930s, where some of these programs were put in place, people are living much longer. So on a net basis, for future generations coming up right now, forget the promises made to past generations that are going to draw on the system. Is it better for you, Brandon, to have that extra money that they're withdrawing from your paycheck for FICA taxes and for Social Security? Is that better to put in your pocket so you could choose that? Or is it good to keep this vestige of an old system that has grown much more antiquated, I think, than what we need for this time? We need to think differently and sort of discard these things. So again, the issue is not, is there too much spending? The issue is there too much spending relative to our productive capacity? And is that going to crush future growth potential? Because that's the problem with debt. The problem with debt is that too much debt crushes future growth potential. It deprives resources from the private sector, and that becomes to be a vicious cycle. It gets worse and worse and worse, and it doesn't necessarily end in collapse because the government can always monetize the debts, right? But what it does is it destroys real purchasing power. It creates a lot of apathy in society. It destroys human potential to create and innovate and produce, and it causes this widening wealth inequality gap, which I think the story of our time. When the Fed and when Treasury refuses to let anyone take their medicine and have any pain, when it refuses to spend deficit spending, what it's doing is it's basically telling people that the Kawasaki method you just brought up is the correct way. It's telling the people that are sophisticated with access to resources and capital, plow it all into investments, buy as much Bitcoin. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I hear people on X say, I'm borrowing this to buy Bitcoin. I'm borrowing this. I'm leveraging this. I'm trying to get my house. I'm not saying they're crazy or wrong. I actually think it makes a lot of sense when you have a system where they say, we're not going to allow a recession to take hold. We're not going to allow deleveraging.
I don't know if you follow Richard Duncan at all. I haven't as much in the last few years, but I used to, 10 years ago. And he'd always say that we're really in, which is no shock to anyone at this point, but we're in a creditism, crony capitalism, but creditism society. And his big thing was, U.S. should be pouring, and it's funny because now it's coming to fruition in a sense of like people are selling, hey, print, hit the printer and, for all intents and purposes, and buy Bitcoin. He was always saying, 10 years ago, hey, you should be hitting the printer and then investing into AI. Like the government should be doing those things. Like, why aren't we doing those? It might have even been 15 years ago, but it just made me think of that world where we're now, he was talking about like 15, 20 years ago. And now we're coming into that where it's like people are finally talking about hitting the printer button, so to speak, and then, hey, we're going to pour it into this, like you said, good investments versus bad investments. I think it's a really important point.
It's a very simple analysis that you should conduct. Okay, number one, the government should spend the majority of its money on something that's going to increase long run productivity. It's that simple. And if you're not, and you can make an argument for every single federal expenditure, whether it does or doesn't do that. For example, okay, military spending. Okay, I know people complain about bloated military spending, but there is plenty of military spending that I think indirectly increases our productive output because it creates our status as a global hegemon. So some of that spending is good, right? Some is bloated, right? We can talk about at the margins, cutting some of that. There are also other cohorts of spending that's absolutely terrible, completely wasteful, does not contribute to any productivity. But like, one thing that I'm strongly in favor of, and I tend to be very, free market oriented, but I really believe in investing in early childhood education. Like, to me, like, investing in the future, investing in early childhood education, being able to make it where no matter where you're born, no matter what zip code you live in, you have access to very early on intervention. We see the data, we see the statistics, we know how much that matters. And yes, if you don't want to use the government programs, you don't want to have access to that, fine. But it creates profound benefits to society when, no matter where you are, you're going to have the ability to get a high quality education. And the data shows the earlier you intervene, the more resources you pump into that in a concerted way, you're going to have long run outcomes that are going to be really beneficial from society. You're going to have lower rates of crime. You're going to have a better job force, a more educated job force. So, like, in terms of education spending, it should be primarily directed at early education, because we know how important it is. But that's just one example. There's plenty of things we can go down the list on. If there's wasteful spending, right, that does not increase our productive output, we really have to scrutinize that and see, does it make sense to keep spending this much money on it?
This transitions perfectly into Doge. I wanted to ask you about this quick. So wasteful spending, etc. Have these boys painted themselves into a corner? Meaning, they're talking big talk, and there's all kinds of campaign talk. We're going to cut $2 trillion. We're going to do this and that. What is the job they have laid out before them, again, so to speak? What does this look like? Are they going to be able to cut anything? Is it just going to be outgrow the system, kind of to what we've been talking about a little bit? What does that look like to you?
Well, if you want the answer to that question right there, and you like that spicy clip, check it out here. Come on, we'll see you in there. But if you want the full interview in its entirety, all the spicy clips put together, and you're not going to want to miss it, believe me, then check that out here. Come on, we'll see you in there. Do it.